I will go ahead and help Mr. Nguyen out. I would like to introduce to you Mr. R.J. Del Vecchio. Mr. Vecchio is a Vietnam veteran. In the US, we call Vietnam veteran. He's a Vietnam veteran and a member of the North Carolina VVI, and also the Vietnam Veteran for Factual History. That is very important. A founding member of VHF, which is the Vietnam Healing Foundation. He has studied extensively the history of Vietnam and has lectured about it at schools and colleges. Mr. Del Vecchio served in Vietnam as a combat photographer in 1968, the year I was born. His collection of photographs has been on display at different museums and universities around the country. You might have seen some of his photographs in textbooks, some of the famous ones on the Vietnam War. His collection, or a small part of his collection, is also on display outside here if you would like to see. And now I would like to present to you Mr. Del Vecchio.
Xin chào quý vị. And I will be continuing in English mostly. If they sold a chip I could put in my head to let me speak Vietnamese, I'd pay $10,000 for it. But they don't have one of those. So to you older Vietnamese, I can only say, Xin lỗi. I'm actually here to speak to you younger people. So, are there any younger people still back there? I hope so. Okay, good. Let me talk about what we have in common, you younger people and myself. I am the child of immigrants, as you are. My mother was born in a different country. My father was born in a small apartment at home. And my parents didn't have American names. My father's name was Giovanni Del Vecchio. My mother's name was Pia Bonuccelli. Italians started coming to this country in the 1880s, and they were not considered to be white people until well into the 1930s. Even when I was young, there was still some people who looked at me suspiciously because I had a last name that didn't sound American. And the nice thing about being American, I tell people, is American is not your name or your skin. American is your heart and your mind. That's what makes it. People have come here for a lot of reasons. My grandparents, I'm very grateful to them. They came here not to save their lives, not to flee oppression, but for a better life for themselves and their children and grandchildren. Other people have come here for more serious reasons. When I was growing up, I met Polish refugees, Hungarian refugees, Cuban refugees, all people who came here the same way, to stay alive, to avoid oppression and persecution where they live, okay? That's really important. In our country, we take two things for granted: air and freedom. But if you don't have air, you'll miss it. If you don't have freedom, you'll miss it. Most of us younger people, we just don't think about freedom. Your parents and your grandparents, they think about freedom. It means a great deal more to them. And I hope with time, you will have an appreciation of how important freedom is. Let me give you the American point of view. You've heard a lot, or at least some from your parents and grandparents, about Vietnam and the war. And I can't comment on the way they think about it, but I will talk about myself. Why did I volunteer to go to Vietnam? Why would I go to a strange country on the other side of the world where I didn't speak the language and didn't know anybody? Well, because I had studied communism from an early age. When I was young, we were very aware of the threat of communism. After World War II, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, country after country became communist. And all the reports about life there were not good. Not good at all. Okay? So we decided in the West that we would do containment, we would hold back communism. And that happened in many places. It happened in Malaysia, it happened in Greece, it happened in Italy. And the most recent place was Korea, where a communist North had sent guerrillas into the South and then invaded the South to take it over and make them communist. And we, the free world, fought them back and saved South Korea. And today, South Korea is free and prosperous, and North Korea is hell. It was a good thing. I read about what was going on in Vietnam, and I knew that the war against the French was a combination nationalist war, people who really were nationalists, and some communists. But the communists came to dominate. And after the French were gone, and the country was split to a communist North, where they were never elected, they just took power. And a freer South, where the government wasn't perfect, but it was a lot freer than they were up north, okay? That it became in the interest to defend freedom, to defend South Vietnam. President Kennedy once said, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty." And I believe that. And I had great sympathy for the people in South Vietnam. That's why I volunteered to go there. And that's why we fought, and that's why we hoped to do there what we had done in Korea. And I can only apologize deeply for the fact that we failed. The loss of South Vietnam was not the fault of the South Vietnamese. It was the fault of the Americans who didn't support them well. Okay, just to give people, those of you who are young don't know all this stuff, in the early 1960s, the South had a lot of problems. There was corruption, there was political divisiveness, the military units were mixed. Some were very good, the Marines and Special Forces were very good, some of the other units were not so good, some of the units were terrible, okay? But they got better. The VC were running a very effective campaign of terrorism. Over 10 years, they assassinated over 36,000 people. They kidnapped over 65,000 people, almost every one of whom was taken to the jungle and killed secretly and buried there. If you want to think about that, in this state of North Carolina, that would mean 59,000 people would have been assassinated and taken away. In this state, 59,000 people would have been gone, which means all of you would know of people who had been killed and kidnapped, okay? That's how extreme it was. That's what was worth fighting. We had some support. In 1965, the Marines would enforce basically to support the South until it could take care of itself. It was not a war. People said we lost a war in Vietnam. We didn't fight a war in Vietnam. We fought a holding defensive action. If you fight a war like we did in Korea, you invade the other South, the other side. You bomb them to pieces. There are no ways that they can get away. You don't let them go to Laos and Cambodia and hide. You hunt them down anywhere. No, we fought a defensive war. We did that from 65 through about 1971. In the middle of all that, there were some anti-war people in Vietnam, but not very many. After Tet 68, which you will hear a lot about, before Tet 68, there was a lot of mixed feelings in the South. There were some people who thought, well, maybe it wouldn't be that bad under the North. Maybe Uncle Ho is not that bad of a guy. And then came Tet. And And then came the massacre of 5,000 people in Hue. And everybody in the South realized, wait a second, this is not good. The South Vietnamese Army did not have to recruit in 1969 because there were so many volunteers. They become much better. They fought very well during Tet. The communists took an enormous beating during Tet. The only bad part was, it was a great military victory. It was a terrible political and psychological loss because the anti-war people of the United States made it sound like everything was going to pieces and we had to get out. And that wasn't true at all. But that's what they made it sound like. We withdrew, Vietnamization took place. We were properly supporting South Vietnam. In 1972, in the Eastern invasion, some people think, the VC won with barefoot guerrillas in black pajamas carrying old weapons. I got news. 200,000 men came across the border, like Rommel went into France in World War II, with 400 tanks, 1,000 pieces of artillery, 12 divisions. And we, the United States military, we were there. Who stopped them? The South Vietnamese military stopped them in bigger battles than we fought. And they trounced them, they 40% casualties, and sent them fleeing back into the north. Everything was wonderful. We had done what we should have done. We got the South to where it could take care of itself. We had made all these promises to support them. Everything was fine. Except politics came in and we steadily cut the aid to the South, where the Russians steadily increased the aid to the North. Well, if you have two fighters and you're not feeding one and you're feeding the other one, over time, who's going to win? The Russians and the Chinese actually provided much more support to the North than we ever supported to the South. Russia gave 5,000 trucks, over 1,200 tanks, several thousand pieces of artillery to the North, far more than they ever had in the South. And they, to give them their due, they took 2 years to build up, and when they came in 75, there was no stopping them. And to the great sadness and tragedy and shame, South Vietnam fell. And people left. They left for the sake of living, for getting out, for getting out and surviving. And even the initial leaving was one thing, but once 75 came and the oppression came, and somewhere between 60 and 70,000 people were executed, 1.3 million went into the camps for as long as 17 or 18 years. General LÂ N Thạo was in there for 18 years. They had a 30% death rate. There are people here whose relatives died in the camps. There are people here who almost died in the camps. And I admire that they survived. That's what went on. And the boat people left knowing there was a 25% chance of dying on the way out. They suffered enormously. Life from 1975 to 1995 was terrible in all of Vietnam. By the way, here's a little known statistic. Not only were there boat people coming out, 250,000 Vietnamese left the north to go to China. That's how bad things were, okay? So it was a terrible, terrible time. People were starving, Marxist economics don't work, and everybody who could, especially if you worked for the South Vietnamese government in any capacity, if you were a clerk, if you were in the motor vehicle department, you had now a special status where you, your children, your grandchildren would be discriminated against. You couldn't hold certain jobs, you couldn't go to certain schools, and that still goes on today. Okay? It is still today a police society. Now, I've been back there 4 times. Life is better now than it was in those days. It is still a police state where everyone knows, just follow the rules, because if you don't, you look like a nail and they have a hammer, and life becomes difficult very quickly, okay? So that's why people came here. Vietnamese culture goes back 2,000 years. They spent 1,000 years fighting the Chinese and also each other. And the sad part is the only people who ever really conquered them have been other Vietnamese. And I pray, as many people do, that in times to come, eventually, freedom will come back to the Vietnamese people. But you young people, you have a double heritage. You have the heritage of this country, which I hope you take to heart, and you have the heritage of your ancestors in Vietnam and a wonderful culture there. So I recommend that you appreciate both and you understand better all that your parents and grandparents went through. And if you wonder why we have these ceremonies, which may almost seem to you like, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on for things that happened a very long time ago. Your parents and grandparents, their love of South Vietnam is not something they put on like a coat. It's like the heart in their chest. It's part of who they are. And you cannot expect that to change in any way, shape, manner, or form. So the way I honor my grandparents and my parents for bringing me here and taking me up, I hope you honor your parents and grandparents for all they've gone through and all they've brought you to. And I wish you a wonderful life and that you will be, Vietnamese are the best immigrants this country's had in the last 50 years, and I hope you will all become and appreciate being great Americans. And if there are any questions about my pictures later, I'll be glad to answer them. And that's all I can say right now, other than Xin chào quý vị, cảm ơn quý vị.